politician and every high school student needs to read this book. But just so you don't think that I'm like effusively, praising this book, I'll read some of the other things that have happened. The Book of Unknown Americans was a New York Times Notable Book of 2014, one of Amazon's top 10 books of the year. It was a Washington Post Notable Book, an NPR Great Read. It was chosen as one of the best books of the year by Bookpage, Booker.com, the School Library Journal. It was also long-listed for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. So I'm in good company when I say I love this book. Henriquez is also the author of The World in Half, which is a novel, and Come Together, Fall Apart, which is a novella of stories. You have to let your friend take that. Her stories in nonfiction have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and like 20 other things that I won't read right now. But please join me in welcoming Cristina Henriquez to the Margaret Mitchell Office.
Two young kids at home, and so I feel like I never can manage to get out of the house for anything. So I'm always so impressed when I come out to events and see people who have actually left their house to do something. So thank you for coming here. This has been billed as a lecture, although that makes me feel sort of uncomfortable, like I'm supposed to deliver some kind of information for you that maybe I'm not equipped to give you. And my primary job in life these days, it seems, is to be a storyteller. So I thought maybe I would come here and tell you a few stories instead. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and about how I came to write this book. And then hopefully read maybe 2 short sections from the book, and then open it up if you guys have questions for me about writing or about the book or about me. I'm happy to answer anything that you'd like to throw at me. That's always my favorite part of any event. So hopefully you'll be thinking of things along the way that you want to ask. I thought maybe I would start off by telling you the very embarrassing story of how it is that I became a writer. And the truth is, and this is a story I didn't tell for a very long time, but the truth is that it started with a boy, as many stories do, a boy that I liked in high school. And when I tell you that I liked him, I mean that I was soul-crushingly in love with him. And I used to go around all of the time telling him how I felt about him. So we would be at a party at somebody's house, and I would somehow corral him into a corner and tell him, I really like you. And I would call him really late at night after my parents were in bed, and I would tell him, I really like you. And eventually, he got really sick of this. So he came into school one day with a blank journal that he had bought. And I remember very specifically, I was standing by the water fountain in the hallway, and he walked over to me and he handed me the journal, and he said, why don't you write down everything that you want to say to me for a year, and then give this back to me. And I said, sure. So I took the journal home with me, and I started writing. And at first it was really writing entries that were just to him. They were like how great he looked in calculus that day, or the funny thing he had said in study hall. And part of the appeal of him for me was that he was intensely smart. So like we were friends. We would sometimes play Scrabble together in study hall. And he one time played the word bivouac, and I was like, I love you. It was just the best thing I thought. So I would write about stuff like that, and I did that for about 3 weeks or so. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I realized that I loved, at the end of the day, just sitting down and writing. It didn't really matter if I was writing to him or what I was writing about. I just loved the act of sitting down and writing every day. And so I kept going, and I started just writing things for me, and I was playing around with language and experimenting and doing all sorts of things, and I wrote in the journal for the full year. And everybody always asks me, did I give it back to him at the end of the year? And I did, in a moment of tremendous bravery. I handed it back to him and he read it, and he thanked me, and nothing happened. And trust me, I wish that story had ended differently for a number of reasons. But we're actually still friends now to this day. He's just a good guy. And a few years ago, he gave me the journal back. So I have it now, and it's really, really cringeworthy to look at it. I mean, it's full of so much teenage angst. But at the same time, it's also this really beautiful document of a time that ended up being extremely formative for me. I didn't really know it at the time, but that was really looking back on it, the moment that I can pinpoint that I fell in love with writing. You know, the way I end the story usually is to say I fell out of love with the boy, and I fell in love with writing. And I kind of never looked back from that point. When it was time for me to leave for college, I thought maybe I should study writing. My dad thought I would never get a job as a writer, so he encouraged me to think about something like journalism instead, which seemed maybe like a compromise. So I went to Northwestern, where they had a really good journalism program, and I didn't even think twice about it. Like, that was not an option for me, ever. It's just not something that was interesting to me, and it turns out that whenever I try to write nonfiction, I'm very, very bad at sticking to the facts, and you can get yourself into trouble very quickly that way. And I knew that early on, so I took a poetry class first, thinking that maybe I wanted to be a poet, and it turned out that I was just tremendously bad at poetry. The next class in the sequence happened to be fiction, and I took that class, and I always say it was as if I had been in the wrong gear my whole life. Suddenly it just sort of clicked into place. I was like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I applied. At Northwestern, they have an undergraduate writing program that you have to apply to get into, and I applied to that program, and I got rejected. And I'm always very keen to tell high school students that, especially, you know, there's no real easy road to figuring out this writing business. And I was devastated at first, but I spent the next year just writing on my own, and I kept working at it, and I applied again the next year, and then I got into that program that year. When I finished college, I thought, well, now maybe I'll get my master's degree. And I went to the U.S. News and World Report and looked at the top 20 graduate programs in the country, and I picked 5 of them, and I applied to them, and I got rejected to all of them. And again, I was devastated. But I had a job at that point at the University of Chicago Press on the south side of Chicago, and I was working basically as like a glorified photocopier. But the great thing about that job was I had an office with a door. So I would close the door when I was supposed to be doing other things, and I would work on stories on my computer in my office, because I didn't even have a computer at home. This was before the days of anybody having, you know, internet or computers or anything in their own spaces. And I would work on stories during the day, and I did that for like 2 years. And I would print out the story, and I would fold it, put it into an envelope, and I would mail it to one of my old professors at Northwestern, who would read the story, who would mark it up, who would write me a letter with his response and his critique, and he would put that in an envelope and mail it back to me. And I would open it, and I would make the according changes, and then I would keep doing that. And I did that for 2 years. And then I applied again to graduate schools. And the first school that I heard back from them was the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I knew was the top, but I didn't know when I applied. The year that I applied, I think there were 961 people who applied for the fiction program, and there were 25 who got it. And I miraculously was one of them. So as soon as I heard from them, I said, yes, I'll go. And I went to Iowa, feeling sort of like an imposter, though, you know, waiting at any moment for someone to jump out behind the curtain and say, you aren't actually supposed to be here. But I spent a lot of those first few workshops turning in stories that were set in the United States. And the reason that I was doing that is because I was mimicking, essentially, the stories that I had grown up reading, the stories that had meant something to me when I was coming up through high school and through college. And so I was mimicking people like George Saunders, and Anne Beatty, and Donald Barthelme. And all of those stories were sort of passable. You know, people were giving them, pretty good responses, but nothing was spectacular in any way. And then one day I went to a used bookstore in Iowa City, and I was browsing around, and I found an anthology in the bookstore, which was the Oxford Anthology of American Short Stories. And I brought the anthology home with me, and I was standing in my apartment, and I started flipping through it. And in it, there was an excerpt from The House on Mango Street, which I had never read before, and had never heard of before. I'd never even heard of Sandra Cisneros before that moment. And it's sort of amazing to me, it's sort of shameful now to think back on it, that in high school, there was no one I read, essentially, I can't think, honestly, of a single example of a writer I read who wasn't white. And there were barely any women writers that we read. And all through college, I went to Northwestern, which at the time was a top 10 university and might still be now. I majored in English, minored in Spanish languages and literature, and I almost never had encountered any Latino literature until I read this excerpt from The House on Mango Street. And I read the first few paragraphs, and I looked up, and it was as if the whole world around me had sort of been transformed. My father is from Panama. My mom is from New Jersey. But all my life, we've spent going to Panama and visiting my father's side of the family there. So my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and I've been going since I was 8 months old, and we would go pretty much every year. And we had all these really rich experiences of going to Panama. We were never going as tourists. It's funny because now Panama has turned into sort of a tourist hotspot, and people often will come up to me and ask me, or they'll email me out of the blue, like, I'm going to Panama, where should I eat? I'm like, I have no idea. Unless it's my grandmother's kitchen, I don't know what to tell you. Because we would get up and we would eat pork chops in the kitchen, and we would hang laundry on the back line, and we would hurry to pull it in if it was going to rain, and we would go to the pharmacy and pick up a prescription, and we were just doing all of the sort of normal things that any Panamanian who lived there would be doing. But there were these really, really deep and profoundly personal experiences for me. And I had never, here I was at Iowa, trying my best to be a writer, and it had never occurred to me to write any of those experiences down. And the reason I think really is because, books had a really special relationship. I had a really special relationship to books growing up. We moved around a lot as a kid, when I was a kid. And I was always landing someplace new, trying to kind of figure out who my people were and where I fit in. But books were a constant. They were a place where I could always turn to and always feel like I fit in somewhere. Except that the only part of me I realized that had been fitting in all of that time was the white American side of me. So I'm half Panamanian, half American. And the books all along had basically been telling me that my white American experience was the only experience that mattered. It was the only experience that had any kind of value, right? Because I never saw myself, I never saw the Latina side of myself, at least, in any of the books that I had been reading. Again, until I got to House on Mango Street. And it wasn't even exactly about my family or about any of my experiences. But even something as simple as seeing the name Carlos on paper, in black and white, did something for me. It opened some kind of door that had previously been closed to me, and that I hadn't even known existed before. So once I read that excerpt, I thought to myself, well, maybe I should write down some of these Panama stories. And I started doing that. But I was doing it all in secret. And I wouldn't show them to anybody. I wouldn't workshop them. It was like one act of bravery to even decide that I was going to write them down. But it was a whole other thing to show them to anybody. So for the whole entire time that I was at Iowa, for 2 years, I spent workshopping stories that were set in the United States, and then in secret writing stories that were set in Panama, and not giving them to anybody. And then when I left Iowa, I had an agent, and I showed her the stories that were set in Panama. she had also previously read some of the other stories that were set in the United States. And when she saw the stories that were set in Panama, she was like, these are the stories you're supposed to be writing. And the reason was because finally, I wasn't trying to just imitate anybody else. You know, I was writing stories that were really coming from some deep personal well within me. And there was no territory for anybody writing about Panama. There wasn't anybody else I knew who was doing that. It was a wide open field, and I could do it however I wanted to do it. And there was a certain kind of fear in that, but there was also a certain kind of liberation. So I started writing the stories, more and more of them, and eventually I had enough that I wrote a short story collection called Come Together, Fall Apart. All of those stories are set in Panama. The second book I wrote was a novel called The World in Half, again set in Panama. And then this third book, which is the book that brings me here today, The Book of Unknown Americans, was sort of another leap of faith for me. Because it was a book where I had decided I wanted, again, to set it in the United States. But was I able to do that? I had built a career on writing books that were set in Panama, and it had been working for me. And the last time I had tried to set anything in the United States, everything had been falling flat. So it was actually sort of this big decision. Can I write a book now that's set in the United States? And part of the comfort that I gave myself was that I would set it in Delaware, which is where I was born, and also because I just knew that everybody was waiting for the great Delaware novel. And it's a book, really, that's about people from all over Latin America who all end up in this one apartment building together in Delaware. And a lot of people, when the book came out, it got a lot of reviews and has done very well, but often it's described as a book about immigration. And I usually am quick to tell people that no, it's actually, at least for me, it's not a book about immigration. It's a book about immigrants, and that those are very different things to me. Immigration is a system and a set of policies, and immigrants are really the people and the human stories behind those policies. And that was always from the beginning my idea, that I wanted to tell these very ordinary stories of people who were coming to the United States for all different reasons, and who found themselves all kind of adrift, but together, acting sort of as each other's de facto family. And the inspiration for the book's dedicated to my dad, and he's really the inspiration for the book. My dad, as I mentioned, is from Panama. He came to the United States in 1971 to go to the University of Delaware. He was going to study chemical engineering. And he thought he would get his degree and go back to Panama, which is where his family lived and still lives to this day. But he ended up moving down the street from my mom. He lived with a host family who lived down the street from my mom. And my mom, really weirdly, had been to Panama the year before as a foreign exchange student. And she had actually met some of his friends even, although she'd not met him. So when he moved down the street, her mom said to her, why don't you go down and introduce yourself to the nice Panamanian boy who moved in, make him feel welcome. And boy, did she. She was majoring in Spanish at the time, and he needed to learn English. And supposedly they each had, my dad had a girlfriend, my mom had a boyfriend, but somehow that didn't stand in their way for very long. And they fell in love and had me and my brother and sister, and my dad's been here for more than 40 years now. And I've really seen up close, firsthand, what it has been like for him to be an immigrant in this country, and some of the struggles that he's gone through. I mean, even just recently, this was a few months ago, he was traveling to Panama, and he and my mom were going through the airport, and he got pulled aside by Border Patrol down into some kind of room, questioned, for no good reason really. And while he was in there, the guy was like going through all of their stuff, and my dad said something to him, like, what are you doing? And the guy was like, well, I don't know how they do it in your country, but blah, blah, blah. And my dad was like, this is my country, But the fact that he's been here for this long and still has to say that kind of thing, that's the kind of stuff that I've grown up being around and seeing. And I think this book is lot of those feelings that he has about being torn between being here and being there. I think he still feels like he doesn't totally fit in here. And yet when we go back to Panama, he feels like he doesn't totally fit in there anymore either. It's been a long time since he's lived there, and if somebody stops him and asks him for directions, he doesn't know anymore. The country has changed and has passed him by in ways that I think are really painful for him. So I put a lot of that stuff into the book too. My dad did read the book. He called me about 40 pages before the end, and I won't give away any spoilers or anything, but he called me about 40 pages before the end and said he couldn't go on anymore, that he couldn't read it because he was so scared about what was going to happen to the characters. And I told him, that he had to keep going because everybody was going to ask me what he thought of the book. And he did finish it, and he did like it. And the best story that I can tell you about that is that my family and I are all very close. My brother lives in Japan, my sister lives in New York, my parents live in Delaware, and I live outside of Chicago. So we're far-flung geographically, but we're all really close, and we do weird things, like have email threads all with each other. I had to do this questionnaire for an interview once. It's called the Proust questionnaire, and you just answer all of these sort of rapid-fire questions, and the idea is it's supposed to illuminate something about your essential character. And one of the questions is, who's your favorite prose author? And I sent the questionnaire to everyone in my family, and I was like, I'll compile all the answers, and we'll see what we all come up with. And both of my parents, independently, wrote their favorite prose author was Cristina Enriquez. So, very sweet. When I was in graduate school, I had a teacher who some of you might know. She's one of my favorite writers, actually, too. Her name is Marilyn Robinson. And one of her ideas about second drafts of books and of stories was that you should try to boil the project down to one word. And I always think about that when I'm working. And I think for me, this book, The Book of Unknown Americans, really the one word that it boils down to for me is home. That it's really so much about home. And I alluded to this earlier, that I moved around a lot as a kid. I was born in Delaware, moved to Miami, Florida, then to Covington, Virginia, then Terre Haute, Indiana, then back to Delaware when I was in 5th grade. I left Delaware to go to college at Northwestern, then I lived on the south side of Chicago for a few years, then I moved to Iowa to get my master's, then we moved to Dallas, Texas for a few years, and now we're back outside of Chicago, which I've been there for 8 years, which is the longest I've been anywhere. I've been feeling a little bit restless, like we need to move again. But that feeling of dislocation, that feeling of always trying to figure out where you belong and how you belong in a space and in a place, is something that's so deep within me. That idea, really, that notion of what is home, I think that's really what the book boils down to for me. It's about immigrants, but it's really about all of us. There are universal themes here. There are lots of things about, people losing their jobs, the idea of what it means to be a parent, the idea of sacrifice, and guilt, all of those kinds of things are things that anybody can relate to. And I think, the biggest compliment that I've gotten about the book as I go around and do these events is that sometimes people will read it and they'll tell me afterwards that when they finished it, they felt like they see people differently. Very early on, somebody told me, I finished reading your book and then I was driving down the road where these people live in Delaware, and I saw people waiting at a bus stop, and I thought to myself, they have a story. And I think that's not something that I set out to do, but the fact that it's provoked that kind of reaction in anybody has been a very overwhelming and humbling thing. And I think sometimes people ask me, what can we do about immigration? And that's such a huge question. And I think it can feel really overwhelming to people to know how to tackle that. But I think in your own personal life, what we can do is we can choose to tell different stories about each other. And we can choose to listen without judgment to those stories. And if we do that, then I think read a little bit from the first part of the book. There's 11 different narrators in this book. At one point there were 22, which was just nuts. And this first narrator is there's two main narrators, and one of those main narrators is a woman named Alma Rivera. And she has come with her husband Arturo and their daughter Maribel from Mexico, because Maribel has suffered a brain injury in Mexico the year before, and they are bringing her to the United States to get her the kind of education and medical attention that she needs. So this is right at the start, from Alma's point of view. Back then, all we wanted was the simplest things. To eat good food, to sleep at night, to smile, to laugh, to be well. We felt it was our right, as much as it was anyone's, to have those things. Of course, when I think about it now, I see that I was naive. I was blinded by the swell of hope and the promise of possibility. I assumed that everything that would go wrong in our lives already had. 30 hours after crossing the border, we arrived, the three of us in the back seat of a red pickup truck that smelled of cigarette smoke and gasoline. "Wake up," I whispered, nudging Maribel as the driver turned into a parking lot. "We're here, hija." "Where?" Maribel asked. "Delaware." She blinked at me in the dark. Arturo was sitting on the other side of us. "Is she okay?" he asked. "Don't worry," I said, "she's fine." It was just after sunset and darkness bled in from the outer reaches of the sky. A few minutes earlier, we'd been on a busy road, driving through four-way intersections, past strip malls and fast food restaurants. But as we neared the apartment building, all of that had given way. The last thing I saw before we turned onto the long gravel lane that led to the parking lot was an abandoned auto body shop, its hand-painted sign on the ground propped up against the gray stucco facade. The driver parked the truck and lit another cigarette. He'd been smoking the whole trip. It gave him something to do with his mouth, I guess, since he'd made it clear from the moment he picked us up in Laredo that he wasn't interested in conversation. Arturo climbed out first, straightened his cowboy hat, and surveyed the building. 2 stories made of cinder blocks and cement. An outdoor walkway that ran the length of the second floor with metal staircases at either end. Pieces of broken styrofoam in the grass. A chain link fence along the perimeter of the lot, cracks in the asphalt. I had expected it to be nicer. Something with white shutters and red bricks. Something with manicured shrubs and flower boxes and windows. The way American houses looked in movies. This was the only option Arturo's new job had given us, though, and I told myself we were lucky to have it. Silently, in the dim and unfamiliar air, we unloaded our things. Plastic trash bags packed with clothes and sheets and towels. Cardboard boxes filled with dishes wrapped in newspaper. A cooler crammed with bars of soap, bottles of water, cooking oil, and shampoo. During the drive, we had passed a television set on the curb, and when he saw it, the driver braked hard and backed up. "You want it?" he asked us. Arturo and I looked at each other in confusion. "The television?" Arturo asked. The driver said, "You want it? Take it." Arturo said, "It's not stealing?" The driver snorted. "People throw away everything in the United States, even things that are still perfectly good." Later, when he stopped again and pointed to a discarded kitchen table, and later again at a mattress propped up like a sliding board against someone's mailbox, we understood what to do and loaded them into the truck. After we carried everything up the rusted metal staircase to our apartment, after we found the key the landlord had left for us taped to the threshold of the door, Arturo went back down to pay the driver. He gave him half the money we had. Gone. Just like that. The driver put the bills in his pocket and flicked his cigarette out the window. "Good luck," I heard him say before he drove off. So that's kind of their introduction to the United States. And then this is toward the end of the book. And this is one of the characters named Micho Alvarez. And when I mentioned that there's 11 different narrators, there's these two main narrators, Alma and Mayor Toro. And Mayor is fallen in love with Mayabel, Alma's daughter. But the rest of the narrators are the neighbors who all live in the apartment building with them. And it was really important to me that everybody in the book at some point get a chance to tell his or her family story. So all of those other narrators are just little interstitials that are interspersed all throughout the narrative. And this is Micho Alvarez. This is only part of his story. I came from Mexico, but there's a lot of people here who, when they hear that, they think I crawled out of hell. They hear Mexico and they think bad, devil, I don't know. They got some crazy ideas. Any of them ever been to Mexico? And if they say, yeah, I went to Acapulco back in the day, or I've been to Cancun, puppy, then that shit don't count. You went to a resort? Congratulations. But you didn't go to Mexico. And that's the problem, you know? These people are listening to the media. And the media, let me tell you, has some fucked up ideas about us. About all the brown-skinned people, but especially about the Mexicans. You listen to the media, you'll learn that we're all gangbangers, we're all drug dealers, we're tossing bodies in vats of acid, we want to destroy America, we still think Texas belongs to us, we all have swine flu, we carry machine guns under our coats, we don't pay any taxes, we're lazy, we're stupid, we're all wetbacks who cross the border illegally. I swear to God, I'm so tired of being called a spick, a nethead, a cholo, all this stuff. Happens to me all the time. I walk into a store and the employees either ignore me or they're hovering over every move I make because they think I'm going to steal something. I understand I might not look like much. I work as a photographer, so I'm not in a business suit or nothing, but I have enough money to be in any store. And even if I didn't, I have the right to be in any store. I feel like telling them sometimes, you don't know me, man. I'm a citizen here. But I shouldn't have to tell anyone that. I want to be given the benefit of the doubt. When I walk down the street, I don't want people to look at me and see a criminal or someone that they can spit on or beat up. I want them to see a guy who has just as much right to be here as they do, or a guy who works hard, or a guy who loves his family, or a guy who's just trying to do the right things. I wish just one of those people, just one, would actually talk to me, talk to my friends, man. And yes, you can talk to us in English. I know English better than you, I bet. But none of them even want to try. We're the unknown Americans, the ones no one even wants to know, because they've been told they're supposed to be scared of us. And because maybe, if they did take the time to get to know us, they might realize that we're not that bad. Maybe even that we're a lot like them. And who would they hate then?